Judith, welcome to the show.
Oh, hi, Michael. Nice to be with you.
No, nice for you to have you here too. Now, listen, first of all, take me back where we were 20 years ago. I do remember Frankenstein food. I remember a big scrap between, you probably remember it too, Helen Clark and John Campbell over genetically engineered corn. And then suddenly all the greenies of the time deciding that anything that was going to be genetically modified had to be bad. And I think city councils went through declaring themselves genetically GE-free zones and everything. What exactly happened then?
Well, madness, obviously. And you'll remember it was 2002 election, and I think I remember that Helen Clark called John Campbell a little creep.
That's right.
Or some words to that effect. But also it was a hit job, basically, probably by a even further left-wing than the Labour Party group trying to do in Labour as well. So it was a very strange situation. And, of course, what's actually happened in the rest of the world and in New Zealand, the science has moved on. But you were right to call it a moral panic. So people went round being, I guess it was another form of woke, really, wasn't it? Sorry, I'm just getting over a cold at the moment, so occasionally I'm going to cough. But what it actually did is it meant that New Zealand scientists who were continuing to work in labs with trying to get some approvals for anything, ended up having to have their work taken overseas for it to be field trialled. So we have missed out on all sorts of innovations, and also making use of this wonderful technology called CRISPR, which actually takes a gene and then edits it. So it's not anything other than taking the same gene and doing a tweak in it. And that's the sort of change that has meant that we now have, in the Mulligan Institute in particular, a vaccine that's being worked on for cancer and has been widely seen as being very helpful. We have ryegrass work that has gone on in plant and food, and what they've been doing is being able to work out how to reduce methane from cows by up to 23% and make them drought resistant. The problem is they can't even trial it in New Zealand. They can't get approval to do that. They have to take it to the US to do it.
That's ridiculous.
So we have missed out on all sorts of stuff. And what's actually happened, the rest of the world has understood that the science has moved on, so it has too. And, it's shocking to know, isn't it, that in the US there are no controls on GM. And they have, strangely enough, not all started to grow 3 ears or started to look like the sheep that they're busily eating or anything like that. Canada, Brazil, Argentina have all absolutely adopted GE and GM, and Australia a couple of years ago set up a gene technology regulator, and we're saying we'd turn it into a biotech regulator, which would include all the gene technology, so it's specialist, and make sure that where there are things that are going to really help New Zealand and the world, why shouldn't we be part of it rather than just providing the science for other countries to then go and benefit from? While our farmers, our orchardists and everyone else is left having to use pesticides and more fertilisers and all those sorts of things. It's just madness that we're not adopting these things.
Now, as I understand, currently, no genetically modified crops are grown commercially in New Zealand. That's no fresh fruit.
Correct.
Yeah, no fresh fruit, vegetables, or meat.
There's plenty eaten. There's plenty eaten, though, when we import our apples at various times a year from the US.
Yep.
California's got massive amounts of GE, and they also have, by the way, next door to it, organics. So it's not like one or the other. I mean, it is one or the other, but you don't have to all go GE. You can choose like you do. And so when we go to the UK and we eat food there, something bad happen? No. When we go to the US, no. And we import their food. So, and most soy products in New Zealand are GE'd as well.
Yes. So you're right, the science has moved on, And there are enormous benefits. We are actually, in fact, probably losing trading advantage against some of our particularly food competitors, you would think, on the international market as a consequence as well. The great fear at the time, Judith, you remember 20 years ago, was that, you would have this unregulated Frankenstein component to everything. It hasn't turned out to be true. You would have seen TV1 News, I imagine, last night, seeing what the reaction was to the policy. They went immediately to two people who criticised it. TV1 News did, of course. How do you expect any, apart from the far left of the environmental sector, do you expect any opposition to what is clearly common sense now?
Not really. So just about every scientist that anybody could find in the media is for this. Just about everybody who understands what's happening in the world and also understands the science is for this. But also, even the Green Party came out and said that they were, willing to have a conversation on it. It's only really David Parker and the Labour Party that won't accept the science that they've told us all to accept. We've had years of being told to accept the science, haven't we? And then all of a sudden they don't want to have this science. Their own chief science advisor, the Prime Minister, says this. The Royal Society says this, hardly a right-wing think tank. We've got the Department of Conservation saying they can't stop using 1080 unless they have this. This is the sort of stuff that would mean you don't have to have, you can't do predator-free, basically, unless you do this. And the Royal Society's noted that would be what would make the difference. Michael, we've got a quarter of our country is at risk of wildling pines. And yet we've got the gene technology right now in the Crown Research Institute of Sion, based in Rotorua, where they can turn these pines into sterile so that they don't keep going around populating everywhere they go. Well, they can't actually even get permission from New Zealand EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, to trial this. Surely one of the biggest environmental dangers we've got at the moment are wildling pines, and they can't even trial it. So that will, unless we change this law, that will go overseas. And other countries will benefit. Well, we're going around trying to cut all the wildling pines down.
Or poison them, ironically.
Yeah.
If elected, a national government will, and the 3 bullet points were, end the effective ban on gene editing and genetic modification in New Zealand. 2, create a dedicated regulator to ensure safe and ethical use of biotechnology. And 3, streamline approvals for trials and use of non-GET and GM biotech. It's actually quite conservative, isn't it, really? Because you've still got to go through 2 and 3 before you can use.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that right?
It's still quite conservative, and we know. We're a conservative party, but we also know that New Zealanders are a cautious people. So we're not going to go racing off and doing anything to damage the economy. But I'm going to tell you this: if we don't do this, we will damage the economy if we don't do it, because we are losing massive amounts of biotechnology companies and businesses and opportunities to enhance not only our environment but our export market. So have you heard of a business called LanzaTech? A New Zealand business set up taking the pollution from smokestacks, using GM on it and turning it into a biofuel, which, by the way, after the end of it is no longer GE'd because it's gone through a process. They had to shift out of New Zealand and go to the US, and they say one of the biggest reasons because they couldn't get approval to do what they needed to do outside the lab. They are now worth $1.4 billion US. That's what we're sending overseas. And I've seen the Australians, when they've liberalised along the same lines as we're saying, that they're picking up so much of the work of our scientists because they are now allowing the use of these trials outside the lab. And so, we're just basically we're giving them our lunch and then we're asking them not to eat it. It's madness.
I also noticed, because I did a bit of background on this after we talked yesterday, you and I, about coming on the show, and I went and had a look at the GE policy, and I saw that there was a Royal Commission you'll know this, but listeners won't necessarily. There was a Royal Commission established on genetic modification in 2000, so that's 23 years ago, and its job was to examine the issues surrounding genetic modification, hear people's views, and provide advice. And it finished by saying, and I quote, "It would be unwise," the Commission commented, "to turn our back on the potential advantages on offer from genetic modification, but we should proceed carefully, minimising and managing risks." That was 23 years ago. Now, it seems that instead of minimising and managing risk, they just decided to say, well, we'll take no risk at all. When did that subtle change go from the Royal Commission's, well, don't turn your back on this because it's not too bad really, it can have some great benefits, to, no, we're just not going to do it at all?
That's right. Well, it actually happened after that Corngate thing. And that's when the Labour Party, when they got into government again in 2003, they pushed that through. It's just absolutely mass hysteria, really. And what you ended up with is New Zealand being in a time warp. So when I hear people say, you're going to be releasing this out in the environment, so, well, what are you talking about? If you'd like me to say, yes, we could release, we could do something with possums every time they breed, everything that they end up getting is now sterile. I mean, actually, no, I'd be happy with that one.
Yeah,
but,
and rabbits is another one?
Rabbits, stoats.
Yep.
It's like, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to stand back and wait for the rest of the world to sort things out, and we just, don't? We're not, our economy is, so dependent on agriculture, and we're telling farmers that they've got to do their bit for climate change, and then we're stopping them from doing their bit for climate change. So it's madness, isn't it?
It is. And thank you for explaining that. Now, just I think ahead, you've got, it's about 4 months to the election now, Judith. Yeah, just a little over 4 months. The polls suggest it's close. The polls are usually fairly accurate with sort of 2 or 3 points. Do you get the perception as you're going around the country that there is a metropolitan/provincial rural divide?
Oh, I'm not so sure. I represent Papakura, and I had a meeting yesterday with some people, particularly from the Indian communities. And, the big divide, they said, is, from their point of view, is, the cost of living and law and order have been major areas. But they actually say now crime is so bad now that now crime's number one. So I don't think it's so much that. I think they just, people can't afford to be divided if they can't afford to pay their bills, really, or they can't afford to feel safe. And that's, I think, what it really comes down to. I think the Labour government has, in particular, tried to divide our country. If I look at what's happened, whether it's the nastiness towards people or their views on various things, or whether it's the farmers are suddenly all to blame for everything, they've been very divisive in their language, and what they're not realising is that there's no point saying we hate all the farmers, because actually that's where our money comes from. That's where the money comes from to pay for health and education. That's where it all comes from. It's exports, and unless we can export, we are completely stuffed. And what have we got to export if we're not exporting agricultural products or biotechnology?
Right, but I sometimes think there's a bit of a disconnect. At the end of the day, why does Wellington, for example, the place that you work in, Parliament and all its precincts and around the Wellington region, full of civil servants, continually and so strongly vote to the left? And to the point of installing Tory Whānau as the Green MP, the former Green party apparatchik, as its mayor.
Look, I think if there's a division, it's between Wellington and the rest of the country, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you might be right.
In terms of the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
So when we were in government, we had Labour, basically Wellington's always been a very left town, but when we were in government, there was one election, I think we actually won most of the party vote there. But that's because we were in government and they were working with us and weren't seeing us as the enemy. But look, my experience with most public servants in Wellington, bureaucrats such, is actually if you give them a job to do and tell them what you expect and give them some outcomes you want achieved, they'll get off and do it. But if you sit around and say, let's just all have a group think and have another consult and never actually do anything, well, they'll act accordingly. And if you pay people to end up with no outcomes, you'll probably get no outcomes.
Except I'm interested in, over the last 2 years in particular, the last 3, that sort of whole co-governance thing, which you would have been interested in as well, observing it from a much closer quarter than me. That seems to have proliferated. Where does that come from? Has it come from central government, or has it come from policymakers in Wellington going, oh, this is a good idea, because we're now reinterpreting, for example, stuff as basic as the Treaty of Waitangi?
Well, I think you'll find that it's probably a combination of both. My experience of the bureaucracy is that if you give them a very clear steer as a minister, then they will follow it. And so I guess that's really what it is. And the trouble is, of course, is that New Zealanders are very, very mild people, generally, very mild, don't worry too much as long as it isn't, someone's not coming after us or what we have. But the problem is that that's where people are now getting very angry, and it's mostly, actually, to be frank, it's mostly on cost of living and crime. That's all of our polling and focus groups and everything else. It's what my electorate tells me. Yeah, they're really annoyed about, feeling distant and not really encouraged and wanted in the country, and some people feel like that. But the biggest thing is they can't afford to pay their bills.
I know, and that's right. That's right. And finally, I started my introduction today by having a bit of a rant, because I've got kids who are year 10 and year 12. Year 12's become the critical year in the secondary school year in terms of NCA, even more important than year 13, it would appear these days, and said that my daughter will be missing 5 days out of the next 3 weeks. Has National got any views on the teacher strike and the PPTA industrial action at the moment?
Well, as you know, I'm not the education spokesperson. And
okay, well, what about some personal views?
No, well, we don't have personal views in politics, Michael.
Oh, God, I did all the time. That's probably what got me into trouble, though.
That's probably what got you into trouble.
Yeah.
I'd say this, though. I don't recall the teachers ever striking when National was in government. And we have had the worst outcomes of any education ministers over the years, and Hipkins was the education minister that oversaw a disaster in the whole New Zealand curriculum that's gone on. All this stuff is just nonsense. We need to get kids back to school learning to read, write and do maths.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us, Judith. Nice to have you, and best of luck to you for the next 4 months. Talk to you again soon. Thank you.